Kevin, we can't. Oh wait, you're hold on. You're on mute, Kevin.
Okay, is that good?
Yeah, except we're seeing double of you. There we go. Okay.
Okay. All right, so you can see that now.
Okay.
I've got my first slide up.
Yeah, we can see
Yes, we see it.
Okay, all right, excellent. Okay, so again, what I'm going to share with you tonight is about 13 centuries of history.
I'm taking niggas to killing school. Class starting next week.
Sorry, we're gonna have
you
to
gotta
boot
at least
him.
have
Sorry.
like 2 bodies though. For I ain't coming with no. If you ain't got shit, I can't work with no beginners.
Yeah. Okay.
Did you remove? I tried to. You got it? Did you do it?
Yeah,
Ken?
I got it. Oh. Jeez. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. And about 700 years of Russian history, but I'm going to try to boil it down to some key concepts that have influenced what Putin and Xi want to achieve and why that translates into cybersecurity threats. Because in both the case of China and Russia, in China it's Xi, in Russia it's Putin. These are authoritarian dictatorships. What they are the ultimate leaders. So what they want is what those countries' goals are. And so the one thing that is common with both China and Russia is their goal is to seek a multipolar world. So, and what that means is when the Cold War ended, so for those of you that are old like me, you remember the Cold War, and it was 2 spheres of influence, the free world and the Soviet dominated world. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, we won. Hey, it was great. It was the end of history. It was the triumph of the liberal rules-based order, and the U.S. became the hegemon. We were the most powerful nation in the world, and we didn't have any competitors. Russia and China both want to return to that multipolar world where we are not setting the rules. And that is what they're seeking to do. But unlike the Cold War, where the Soviets had this massive military, and China's been building their military, but they're not necessarily have a lot of experience in conducting operations around the world. They're seeking cyber effects to boost. When I say limited, in the case of Russia, it's definitely limited. In the case of China, they want to increase the likelihood that they can achieve their goals by using cyber operations. So what I'm going to share with you is some key components of why China and Russia want what they want, and then share with you how that translates into why they're conducting cyber operations. So I'm going to start with China. And the reason I'm starting with China is in this post-Cold War world, they are the bigger peer. They are the more powerful peer competitor than Russia. And I call it the Middle Kingdom, and I'm going to get into that. But that's China's view of itself is as the Middle Kingdom. So I'm going to share with you what that is, and again, how what they want to achieve translates into cyber threats to the United States. So I'm going to talk about the Middle Kingdom and Chinese history. I'm going to talk about 100 years of humiliation because that's really driving one of Xi's strategic goals, how Mao impacts that. And then I'm going to talk about in the 21st century and Xi, when he talks about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people, what that means, what are those strategic goals, and then how they have cyber, how these, when we say China is a cyber threat, not just, okay, oh, they're a threat. Again, as an intel analyst, I want to know why they're a threat. What are they trying to achieve? Why are they attacking our critical infrastructure? And that's what I'm going to talk about. So the first thing to talk about, if you're someone in the United States or some from the West, is that China traces its history back to some of the earliest recorded time of humankind, much, much longer than when we trace back Greek or Roman or even Persian or Egyptian. I mean, China the Han Chinese as a civilization go back to at least the 13th century BC. So where we're celebrating, we had our 250th anniversary, 2.5 centuries. They go back 13 centuries. So that's always something to think about. The Chinese view of the world is they've been here as a civilization basically longer than any of the other great powers in the world. And so that shapes their view of the world. So it goes back to the 12th century. And in fact, the imperial era of China goes back to the 2nd century BC. So this is even before Rome became an empire. This is back in the time of the Greek states, and that was the Qin dynasty that lasted until the fall of the Qing dynasty, which we call the Manchus in 2012. So they've got this history of thousands and thousands of centuries of Han Chinese civilization that goes up until 1912. And the height of that civilization that you should understand when they talk about the Middle Kingdom, it's not. When I first heard that term, and I was reading the book On China by Kissinger, and he talks about the Middle Kingdom, I thought it meant kind of like Middle Ages, so it was like the Middle Kingdom in kind of a temporal view. It's not. It's more accurately translated as Central Kingdom. So because China was so advanced, and again, this is something to remember as well when you think about China's view of itself and its place in the world, that China, during the Middle Ages of Europe, which my ancestors come from Central and Eastern Europe, when it was the civilization had collapsed and we had the Dark Ages, China was the most advanced civilization in the world. They had gunpowder and paper and printing, and they had this advanced bureaucratic society where they were when they say Middle Kingdom, it means the central, like an axle of a wheel with the spokes going out. So they're the center of the earth, and everything else is on the periphery around them. So about 1000 BC, they developed this concept of this Chao Empire was the middle of the earth, and everybody else was barbarians. There was no culture in any of these other societies. So that is what they're when G talks about, and I'll get into that. As it shows on this slide, when he talks about all being one under heaven, it goes back to that concept of this central kingdom. And so when we talk about kowtowing, that actually is a term that comes from this period when Chinese in a Chinese court. So this is a picture of the emperor when the barbarians came, and they could be from any country. You can actually read about Marco Polo, or I just read a book about an English diplomat in the 18th century when he appeared before the court. They had to kowtow, which was a series of protestations. It was kneeling and bowing that recognized the emperor as son of heaven. So this is a really important concept, that China views themselves as, they are the center of civilization and everything else around them. So when they talked about barbarians, it didn't matter if they were also another advanced society like Japan or anyone else. They were barbarians, and China was the center or Middle Kingdom. So again, it's kind of a geographic term. So if you think about that, and you think about China being the most advanced civilization, the longest civilization, in the Chinese view, now if you look at world history, other areas started to advance faster. So yes, they had gunpowder, they had porcelain, they had paper. That was all kind of taken. Europeans went there, they discovered they had this, and then if you look at world history, you have the Renaissance, and then you have the Reformation, and then you have city-states developing. So Europe develops, and becomes these city-states that have very advanced militaries, and China, I don't want to say stagnated, but they were the middle kingdom. They were on top, so they kind of, they stayed where they were, and other nations particularly in Europe, started to advance. So by the mid 19th century, you had this King dynasty that had been in power for, hundreds and hundreds of years. And now the Europeans are developing colonies. This is in the 1800s. And so China faced the start of what they call the 100 Years of Humiliation. So it started with the Opium Wars. Britain actually went to war with China to force them to buy their opium. The Britain had conquered Burma. They were growing opium. The Chinese were like, we don't want to buy your opium. And so Britain went to war. They were more powerful. And they forced China. That's what the Opium War is about. They forced China to buy the narcotics that they were developing, because it was going to be good business for the British. And in 1842, they took over Hong Kong. And so that kind of began the 100 Years of Humiliation. In the 15th century, the Portuguese had taken over Macau in southern China, but it was really when the China was forced to cede Hong Kong. And then that became this 100 Years of Humiliation. And you see these flags. This also started these idea of treaty ports and foreign concessions. So China, this advanced civilization, now has these European countries setting up zones in Shanghai and in these treaty ports where Chinese law wasn't, basically they were extraterritorial. So if you've ever seen the movie Empire of the Sun, that opens in Shanghai, you had these areas like in the international zone where Chinese weren't even in control. So important areas of their country fell under the domination of these European powers. And so it was really, it showed China had fallen from being the middle kingdom into being dominated by these European powers. And that 100 Years of Humiliation, in 1912, there was the Chinese, the revolution, the Qing dynasty, the Manchu dynasty was overthrown. They formed a Chinese republic. But then in 1931, Japan, which was becoming more powerful, they had already taken over Manchuria, which is in northwestern China, and they start invading and taking over parts of China. So historians will say that World War II actually started in 1931 when Japan started taking over vast areas of China. And that lasted all the way up until 1945 with the end of World War II. So during World War II, if you look at most of the coastal areas, northeastern China were all under a Japanese occupation. Taiwan was under Taiwan had been under Japanese occupation since 1905, and so they were, this was again a century when this proud civilization that had been so, the Middle Kingdom was under the control of these other Asian and European powers. So I'm going to jump ahead. So Japan was defeated in 1945. Yes, hey, we win the war. We defeat the Nazis and the Japanese. What's interesting is Mao Zedong had formed the Chinese Communist Party in the 1920s after the Russian Revolution, when the Soviet Union came into existence in 1917. And during the war, both the nationalists and the communists were kind of fighting the Japanese. So the U.S. supported both the nationalists and the communists. We sent aid and missions to support both sides. In fact, when the war ended and the communists and the nationalists started fighting each other, we actually sent General George C. Marshall before when he was still when he was still a general, he had been chief of staff in World War II. He tried to create this coalition between the nationalists, which is the KMT, the Kuomintang, and the Chinese Communist Party. It didn't work out. Here you see the nationalists and with Chiang Kai-shek on the right, toasting Mao Zedong on the left. So we tried to get them to work together. It didn't work out. In 1949, the communists defeat the nationalists, and the nationalists flee to Taiwan and set up the Republic of China, which is recognized by the US until the 1970s. Most of the rest of the world recognizes the People's Republic. We are still supporting, because Chiang Kai-shek thinks he's going to eventually, with our aid, go back and defeat the communists and take over China. So Mao is established the People's Republic of China. What is important to understand is that by World War II, the Soviet Union had become, a world power, especially after World War II. They have nuclear weapons, they have a powerful military. China was not a power in the world under Mao Zedong. He tried this great leap forward, which is rapid industrialization. If you see this picture in the center, people were supposed to melt down their pots to make steel in backyard furnaces. It was a disaster. They didn't need the steel, and then they ended up destroying all their pots and pans. So it did not work out. Then he had the Cultural Revolution. These are academics or government officials doing self-criticism. He thought they were losing revolutionary fervor. So people were saying, Xi's father was actually, Xi Jinping, the current leader of China, his father was sent out to work on a farm and was tortured during this Cultural Revolution. Everybody who was in charge was, the Communist Party was riddled with these Red Guards, who were these young students, forced people to work out in the countryside, who were intellectuals. So people died. They didn't grow enough food. So under Mao, because he was the ultimate leader, unlike the Soviet Union, where Stalin died in 1954 and then they established collective leadership, Mao was the guy in charge, and China really didn't advance. So up until 1976, China had not really developed. It wasn't really an economic power. But we want to use them as an ally, or not an ally, but they also don't like the Soviet Union because they've had a break. So we recognize the U.S. recognizes China in 1973 and stops recognizing the People's Republic of China on Taiwan. And so that leads to Mao dies in 1976. Deng Xiaoping, who was one of his acolytes, becomes the leader by 1978, and he embarks on bringing China economically and politically into the world. And so he starts these market-oriented economic reforms, opens up the country to foreign trade, because Deng sees, and this is a key point you also have to remember about how Xi, the current Chinese communist leader, sees the world. The Tiananmen Square was a seminal point in Chinese communist political development. So, Jiang has been leader for 10 years. Chinese is trying to develop. And then in 1989, protests not only develop in China, the protests in China develop because people start protesting in Poland, in Gdansk, under Lech Walesa. There's protests in Hungary, in the Baltic republics, and China sees these protests, and these European communist parties are not squashing them. They're not shooting people in Poland. They're not shooting people in Hungary. And these countries, but even by 1989 in the spring, there started to be, well, these countries might fold or collapse. And Deng was like, that's not going to happen with the Chinese Communist Party. So when they have the Tiananmen Square demonstrations, for several months. By June, Deng goes, we're not going to deal with this. And they just go in. The army moves in and slaughters. We don't know. We didn't have, in 1989, there weren't iPhone cameras. There wasn't the internet, social media. We don't know how many people died, but the army squashed and all of those demonstrations. And that's important to remember, because that's how, this is one of the key goals. This is Xi's view of the world, is focused on China did this and the regime is in power. The Soviet Union, East Germany, they didn't crush the opposition, and now the Soviet Union collapsed. So we're not going to collapse. We're going to engage with the West, but we're going to keep strong, authoritarian, communist control, because keeping the regime is something that is his number one goal. And so Xi was part of the party during this. So I'm going to go back. So you had Deng took over. He knew what it was like and how awful it was in China when Mao Zedong was the ultimate leader for life. So he's like, I'm going to rule for 10 years and then I'm going to hand over leadership. So then Jiang Zemin became leader, and he goes, all right, I'm going to be in charge for 10 years. I'm going to pick a successor, and Hu Jintao is going to become the leader. So that led up, Hu Jintao was the leader up until Xi Jinping assumed control in 2012. And then in 2018, he became leader for life. And people are like, well, why would he do that? China really developed under this collective leadership. It's this dichotomy between Xi wants that China needs to have enough economic development so that its people are happy. They've got consumer goods. They saw the collapse of the Soviet Union because it was all guns and no butter. People were upset because they didn't have cars. They had to wait 10 years to get a refrigerator. They had no economic development, and so they protested against the government, and the government wasn't power, didn't squash them, and so all of the communist states in Europe collapsed. So Xi believes they've gotten to a level of economic development where people now have Huawei phones and they have cars and they have nice apartments. But when that happened in Korea, in South Korea and Taiwan, then people started saying, hey, we've developed economically. Why do we need to have an authoritarian government? And the right-wing dictatorships in South Korea and Taiwan collapsed in the 1980s. So what Xi is like, we've got enough economic development that people are happy, but we can't have any more sort of liberalization. And that's why he's going to be leader for life. He's back to being Mao, but unlike Mao, they've got a nice developed economic system. And so this is his worldview. He is now the leader of a country that, unlike under Mao, is economically developed, part of the global economy, is a player on the world stage. And he's going to rejuvenate and overturn that 100 years of humiliation. So his goal for China is to become a preeminent Asian and global power by 2049. That's the 100th year anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. They want to be a medium level developed economy. And if you go to China, I have not traveled to China. Shanghai and Beijing are very developed, but their GDP of China per person is much lower than the United States because they have still many areas in the rural areas that are not really developed. But his real goal is to create this multipolar world. China wants to be maybe not fully the Middle Kingdom where it's the center of the world, but it needs to be the key player in Asia. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. But he talks about this rise of the East and the decline of the West. So he wants to create an alternative to this rules-based order. And again, when I talk about a unipolar world, at the end of the Cold War, those institutions that were developed by that U.S. and Europe developed after World War II, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, this rules-based order based on transparency, rule of law, a global commons, respect for human rights. He wants that not to destroy it, but wants to create an alternative where you can have a Chinese nation which has no democracy, no transparency, no civil society, no transparency, and they're a player in the world. So that's what he wants to try to achieve. And these are his objectives to try to achieve that. First, maintain the Chinese Communist Party grip on power. Again, both for Putin and Xi, the collapse of the Soviet Union is what makes their worldview. Here was the most powerful communist state, a superpower with nuclear weapons that controlled Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union was the competitor with the US, and it just collapsed overnight. So maintaining the Communist Party's grip on power is something that Xi is going to do. That's what his goal is. He's got to maintain. He can't have the Communist Party collapse. He's going to maintain control. And he's going to take back those territories so that China becomes what it was when it was the Middle Kingdom. So they've gotten back Tibet. They invaded Tibet in 1961. They've gotten back Hong Kong in 1997. Britain gave that back. They've gotten back Macau from Portugal. That happened in 1999. So the last part that they need to get back is Taiwan. If Xi is successful in bringing Taiwan back under Chinese communist rule, he will be the greatest leader. He will be better than Mao. So that is really what drives him and why there's such this focus on Taiwan. And again, he wants to create this regional sphere of influence. So unlike the Soviet Union in the Cold War, it's not necessarily he has to destroy the United States, but he wants to push the United States out of the Eastern Pacific. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, so that China is a peer with the U.S. globally, but China needs to call the shots in its own neighborhood. And that is like it did when it was the Middle Kingdom, where the barbarians are pushed to peripheral. And that's what he's focused on. And then finally, it talks about, a community of common destiny, all under heaven being one family. Remember, that was back in the Middle Kingdom when the barbarians kowtowed, they had to recognize the emperor, son of heaven. Even Xi references that when he talks all under heaven being one family, of course, with China providing that leadership to those parts of the world that don't want to be, that global south, that do not want to be having to adhere to these rules-based order that the U.S. is in charge of. And this provides a little example, and I think kind of helps you understand China's view of the world when you look at the globe. And as a military intelligence officer, when I first was commissioned, I was an armor officer. We always looked at we did and terrain analysis, both tactically and strategic. And I think with the fact that people don't read maps anymore and everything's based on GPS, you kind of lose an understanding of how important geography is. And we don't really study geography. But if you look at the world through US and China's eyes, you kind of get an idea of what their motivations may be and how they view the world. And if you look at they use the word strategic space. So if you look at the United States, we're very, very fortunate in our place on the globe. We are protected by two oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific. We've got Canada and Mexico, and even without all the political statements, there is no, to me, existential threat from Canada and Mexico. No one's invaded us. apart from other Americans during the Civil War since 1812. And if we conduct global commerce, when a cargo ship sails out of Newark or the port of Long Beach in Los Angeles, it's out on the open oceans. It's almost impossible for us to create some sort of economic blockade. But if you look at and all around us are either allies or countries that we have good relations with, there's really no threat in our neighborhood. But if you look at China, it's really different. Yes, it's a big country, a lot of population, but they're not dominant in their own neighborhood. First, they have Russia to the north, which they seem to be getting along with now, but they fought several wars in the 60s and 70s. They've got India on the southwest, who they fought wars with in the 50s and in the 60s, and they're still engaged in conflict over this glacier. And if you look to the south, they've got Vietnam, who they fought a war with in 1979. And even more importantly, if you look at where they are in the Eastern Pacific, they've got Japan, who occupied large areas of the country less than, during World War II, so 80 years ago. And they're a U.S. ally with U.S. troops stationed in Japan, including Okinawa, which you don't even know on this map, but is this island chain. You've got Korea, South Korea, which is a U.S. treaty ally, U.S. troops in South Korea. They've got Taiwan, which they don't control, that has a defensive pact with the U.S. They've got the Philippines, U.S. treaty ally, Thailand, U.S. treaty ally. And when a ship sails out of a Chinese port, there's this first and second and third island chain. So the first island chain are the islands, the Ryukyus, that go from Japan down to Taiwan. Then they've got the Philippines. There are multiple choke points where China could be cut off. So when they talk about becoming the preeminent power in Asia, it means their goal is, again, not to destroy the United States, but to sever us from our allies, so that we are a Pacific nation. China we have troops and treaties with nations that border China. China does not have that with the United States. So we are a key player in the Western Pacific. And so that is what China seeks to do. Their goal is to try to sever us from our alliances and push us out of the ability to influence what they want to do in the Western Pacific. So given all of that background and history, okay, what are the current threats that we see from China, and how does that translate into cyber threats that may be affecting your agency, your organization? When we say Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon, what does that mean? What is the motivation for China to do that? So what I'm going to share with you is information from the annual threat assessment of the U.S. intelligence community. This is an unclassified document delivered to Congress, the Senate, and the House each year. You can download a copy if you Google annual threat assessment. It's a great document, 30 pages, unclassified. And these are the key points that I'm going to share with you. Again, I talked about already, one of goals of Xi is this great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation by 2049. Perhaps that means that's when by that time, they want to have taken or not taken over, but restored their control over Taiwan. I don't know, but it definitely means they want to, and they become a peer to the U.S. globally and be the key dominant actor in East Asia or the Western Pacific. That's what they want to achieve. And so they are going to partner with nations like Russia and North Korea that are not part of this rules-based order, and they want to press Taiwan on unification. So that is one of the key, including conducting cyber operations. Are we able to support that? I'm going to get into a little bit of more detail about that. But this great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is really focused on, by 2049, China has really become a global player that is on par with the United States and is the dominant. It has the ability to do what it wants in the Western Pacific without the US being able to influence that. And so they're going to look to project power over Taiwan. And again, I won't go into the 9-dash line, but basically that's kind of their control over the entire South China Sea. So they've been engaged because there may be oil, there may be gas, there's fishing rights. And again, that's part of that Western Pacific where they should be the dominant power. So they're going to try to influence Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, where they're calling the shots and they control that area. And they're going to again look at using cyber and information operations to enhance or to make those objectives achievable when they don't necessarily have the proven combat power to achieve that. So they want to be able to project their power, but they want to look at ways to inhibit or to reduce the ability of the United States to interfere with that. And so one of the ways that they're looking to do that is cyber. So this is the assessment from March of 2025. People's Republic of China is the most active and persistent cyber threat to the United States government, private sector, and critical infrastructure. And so, for many years, China was focused on information acquisition. So they were looking to hack into defense contractors and send researchers to universities so that they could acquire key technology and military technology from the United States without having developed it themselves. But now they're really shifted to cyber operations that would have the ability to damage our critical infrastructure. At the same time, they're also compromising U.S. telecommunications, and that probably is to acquire information that will be of value to China. But if they believed that they were going to somehow institute a blockade of Taiwan or actually conduct an invasion, and they wanted to impact the U.S. ability to respond, that's when they would use these cyber operations against our critical infrastructure and military assets. And I'll get into a little bit more of what that means. So again, they need to return that lost province of Taiwan. That is a key goal for Xi. It's a key objective of China to the People's Republic needs to have control over everywhere that's Chinese, and Taiwan is the last place they need to return. They've gotten Hong Kong, they've gotten Tibet, they've gotten Macau, and historically they've used cyber attacks when they've been involved in conflict with India. They have used cyber attacks to, in conjunction with kinetic activity, to increase the probability of success. So if tensions with Taiwan increase, you are going to see enhanced cyber operations. And again, what it means is if Xi wants to move on Taiwan, and this is from a 2023 Politico article, this is a representative who sits on the House Select Committee on China. If Xi moves on Taiwan, he'll launch cyber attacks against the United States as part of that operation on the electric grid, water systems, and communications infrastructure, especially near key military installations. And in 2020, there was a DoD report, and this is a report that's issued every year that talked about cyber attacks to disrupt critical infrastructure, such as power systems, at the initial stage of conflict in order to delay military intervention. And this is from a 2023 analysis that was conducted by the Center for Strategic International Studies. If China decided they were going to implement a blockade, or even more dangerously conduct an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, the targets would probably fall into three categories: electric power facilities, then pipelines and railroads, and then logistics and communication systems, including supply chains for manufacturing precision-guided munitions and military aircraft around those areas where there are naval and air bases, including California, Hawaii, and Washington State. And why is that? Is because at the end of the Cold War, the U.S., with the downsizing of our military, we used to be a forward position military. So we had more troops in Korea than we have now. We had bases in the Philippines, like Clark Field and Subic Bay and Naval. We don't have that anymore. And so if we were going to deploy military forces to defend Taiwan, if that was the case, or to be able to impact Chinese People's Liberation Army operations, we would have to deploy them from the United States, from Hawaii. So that would mean we would have to move military equipment on rail cars, get it to ports in the West Coast, get it loaded on ships. Those ships would have, so anything that would impact that, impacting power, impacting telecommunications, would help China, would enhance the likelihood of Chinese success. So that is what they would be targeting. And we're seeing that even more so just within the last year with this Volt Typhoon. So this is a joint cybersecurity advisory that was issued last year in 2024. And what we're seeing with Volt Typhoon is attacks or China being able to get into critical infrastructure, including a water utility in Hawaii, major ports on the West Coast, getting in and scanning infrastructure in Guam that would, as they say, sow chaos or snarl logistics in the event of a U.S.-China conflict. So right now, it would be they're in these industrial control systems and infrastructure through this Volt Typhoon campaign, so that if the U.S. decided we needed to move military equipment, they would actually be able to shut down power systems, be able to shut down water utilities if they chose to do that. And this was a cybersecurity advisory. This is unclassified. This is available through CISA, that talked about pre-positioning themselves for disruptive cyber attacks against critical infrastructure in the event of crisis. And again, this is based on this goal that China is not only going to return Taiwan to its place as part of the People's Republic of China, but it also is based on China being that they're going to be the dominant actor. So they need to push U.S. ability to engage in military activities in the Western Pacific, and this is how they're going to do it. And the other effect that they are looking to do with this pre-positioning is also, they know in a democracy that the people have a vote. Xi doesn't have to worry about what the Chinese people feel about if he wants to invade Taiwan. He's not going to be reelected. He doesn't have to worry about voting. He's just going to do it. But the Chinese know that in a democracy, the people have a vote. So this is also a campaign that could affect our will as a nation. China could say, hey, if the lights start going out, if water stops flowing, people may say in the United States and voice their First Amendment rights that may impact our government's decision to say, why should we be defending Taiwan? All right, if China, the People's Republic, puts a economic blockade on Taiwan, why should the American people say, why should we support them if China is going to shut off my power or shut off my water? So this is something that there could also be a motive to do that, is why they're going to conduct these cyber attacks. And so the Volt Typhoon has been looking at, the Volt Typhoon actors have been looking at communications, energy, transportation, water and wastewater in the United States, as well as territories like Guam, which is a major power projection platform, where U.S. forces would use that to conduct operations in the Western Pacific or in East Asia. And so we haven't seen power be shut off, but they're positioning themselves so that they could conduct these disruptive effects in the event of tensions with the U.S. And one way that they're doing it is this living off the land. I'll wrap up with this. I wasn't really sure, what this was, but it's where they're not your malware. It's not malware. China is using existing systems that have vulnerabilities. So if you run some sort of malware scan, you're not going to see that they're there. And so they're going to use things like PowerShell or Windows Management Instrumentation. So they're going to use vulnerabilities in systems that are supposed to be on your network. So this is why it's critical that cyber hygiene is so important, because if you make sure that all of your systems are up to date, you don't have any applications that aren't used anymore. If you've patched everything, this is not going to make you 100% safe, but it's going to really, really make you less of a target for the Chinese, because that's what they're doing. They're looking for these systems that you're not using anymore or have vulnerabilities, and they're using these living off the land techniques. Okay, so that's China, and I've been talking a lot about China. Let's get on to Russia. I'm sure you all want to hear about this, and I call this portion "Return of the Tsar." This is a little bit more interesting for me, because most people in the United States we don't engage with Russia. Even during the Cold War, like, we didn't have Soviet students studying in the United States. We didn't buy things from Soviet Union. China's really engaged as a world player. So it's a lot of people have an understanding maybe of China because we interact with China. People travel to China. We have Chinese graduate students and we do business with China. We really don't do anything with Russia. So unless you really have studied Russian and Soviet history, you may not understand what Putin is all about and why he thinks he's going to be the greatest czar since Alexander II. So I'm going to talk about ancient Russia. I'm going to go through this very quickly so I can hit my key points. But unlike China, Russia is a much more modern. Russia is part European, part Asian, so it's a much more younger. The concept of Rus or Russia as a civilization only really developed in about the 7th century AD. So in ancient Russia, you had all these nomadic tribes. So what consists of the European part of Russia back in ancient times consisted of these nomadic tribes like the Scythians who came from Asia. There were Greek colonies on the Crimea. This, when Jason the Argonaut sailed off to find the Golden Fleece, he actually sailed through into the Black Sea and went to kind of the southern coastline of Ukraine in that poem. And then I'm going to Kievan Rus, this concept of invasions and what that means into Russia's strategic space. So Rus as a concept, so when Putin talks about Rus, he's really, when they talk about Kievan Rus, Kiev was kind of the center of where this concept of Russian civilization developed, and it's Rus. So in the 9th century, so in the 800s, the Vikings, and you see on this map, they sailed through the Baltic. They went down this river in what was the European present-day Russia to where Kiev is, and then down to the Black Sea, and then sailed to Constantinople. So these Vikings, it was called from the Varangians, who were the Vikings, to the Greeks. The Vikings used this as a trading route. So they would bring fur pelts and amber and timber down through the rivers to the Constantinople, and they would return with all kinds of cool things like porcelain and glass and glassware and valuable products. So there's this concept of Rus was this Rurik dynasty, and Rus means like red. So the Vikings had red hair. So this this Kievan Rus was kind of the first development in the 9th and 10th centuries of this unique civilization of Russia that developed. And you can see Kiev on this map. But what really impacted the development of this Russian civilization is that, unlike China, which was centered on this large expanse, European Russia really doesn't have any natural protection. So unlike England or the United Kingdom, which is an island, or France, which had the Pyrenees and the Rhine, or Italy, which is a peninsula protected by the Alps, there was really no kind of natural geographic protection. So even after it developed as the Rurik dynasty, you had the Mongols invading from the east. First you had the Huns, and then you had the Mongols. So you can see how they took over parts of what is currently European Russia, and it fell under this Mongol domination. And then in the 13th century, you had invasions from the west. So this is Alexander Nevsky. He was the Prince of Novgorod, which was a city on the last map up in northern Russia. And the Teutonic Knights were these Germanic Christian crusaders, and they sailed in the Baltic. And this is from a movie in 1940 called Alexander Nevsky, directed by Sergei Eisenstein. You see Alexander Nevsky's tall and proud. The Teutonic Knights have German-style helmets. This is just before World War II broke out, so it was, it's this Russian concept of these Westerners from Europe are always invading us, and here they are, even in the 13th century. But they even look, the Germans are still invading us today. And so that is, I'm going to a little bit more about that, but that is the first thing to understand about Russia's view of the world, and Putin's view, being a student of Russian history, is that Russia is under the threat of invasions, and it needs to be protected because these foreigners are always trying to invade us. The second thing, and I'm going to talk about three key things: the concept of Russia being invaded, this concept of Moscow being the third Rome, and this concept of the Trinity of all the Russians. So Moscow, so you had all the invasions, but then this map shows, Rome was conquered by the barbarians, the Visigoths, in 476. The Eastern Roman Empire survived in Constantinople, and that became the second Rome. So the original Rome was the center of Christianity. It was conquered. The Constantinople became the capital of the Byzantine Empire. That became the second Rome. That was the center of Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And then that was conquered by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. So Moscow is now the center of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which is the pure form of Christianity. So one thing that Putin does is he celebrates this Eastern Orthodox culture and talks about Moscow being the third Rome. And then the third part of Putin's worldview is this concept of the Trinity of the Russian people. And I'll get into a little bit more on the map, but basically what that states is there's the Great Russians, which are centered in Moscow, the heartland of Russian culture. Then you have Belarusians. They are the White Russians. There's a country called Belarus, but they're White Russians. Their capital is Minsk. And then you have Little Russians. So the Ukrainians, even though that's where the Rus dynasty started, in the Great Russian view, the Ukrainians are the Little Russians, the little brothers, but they're all part of this Russia. So in the 18th century, the Tsar had the title Tsar of all the Russias, and the Russias were Great Russia, Little Russia, and Belarus. So that's how Putin sees Ukraine. And I'm not saying that's correct, but that's how he views it based on his understanding of Russian culture, that the Ukrainians are not Ukrainians, they're Little Russians, and they need to be all together in this one empire. And I'm going to go back to the invasion, because even though we had the Mongol invasion in the 8th century, the 10th century, and the Teutonic Knights in the 13th century, modern Russians' view of the world is based on this horrible history they have of being invaded from Western Europe. Here you can see on the left, Napoleon, he invaded in 1812, made it all the way to Moscow. There, they actually burned Moscow. Then you have the Nazis invading in 1941. They make it all the way to Moscow. They capture it. But where we in the United States have actually not experienced being it, we fought World War II. Nobody was invading the United States. There are Russians alive today that know what it was like to have Nazis conquering your country, and they lost millions of people. So the idea of Russian security is based on this concept of we must achieve our political objectives so that we won't be invaded again. And it's not just, I mentioned those two, but you had the Teutonic. Sweden invaded in the 18th century in the Great Northern War. Then you had Napoleon in World War I. The Germans and the Austrians invaded. And then I talk about the 21st century. The Russians see our influence in the Baltic states and in Georgia and in Ukraine as just another way of trying to impact and influence, and a foreign nation trying to stir things up in Russia. So it's another example of this series of invasions. And this is how Russia, I talked about strategic space. So this is a map of the Soviet Union. So the Russian Empire that came about in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries under the Peter the Great and Alexander the First and Catherine the Great, unlike the United Kingdom and France and Germany and Denmark and the Netherlands that kind of sailed off into other parts of the world to create overseas empires, Russia created an empire by moving into non-Russian areas that were next to Russia. So this would have been a good view of the Russian Empire in 1918. And what the Soviet Union did when the Soviets came to power is they tried to rebuild that. So Great Russia is this Russian Soviet. So Great Russia is the heartland, it's around Moscow. And then they took over these non-Russian areas like the Baltic states, Belarus, Kazakhstan in Central Asia, and in the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, to kind of give themselves a buffer zone. The only reason Napoleon and Hitler and the Nazis weren't able to defeat Russia is it was so many hundreds of miles that they lost out to the fact that they had to go so far that they lost lots of soldiers. And so the Russian idea of security is having these buffer zones. And this was the ultimate buffer zone that existed during the Cold War. So you see the Soviet Union on the right. So you had Great Russia heartland. Then there were these non-Russian republics like the Baltic states in the north, Ukraine, Belarus. Then the Russians moved into Eastern Europe, created the Warsaw Pact, and had Russian soldiers in Poland and East Germany and Czechoslovakia. So this was 1990. Putin was a KGB officer in Dresden in 1989. If you imagine him getting there in 1987, and I served in Germany from 87 to 90, if you've been invaded, if your grandparents remember the Nazis and you had your relatives killed and in fighting the Nazis, what better way to protect yourself than be a Soviet soldier in East Germany? I mean, that is the ultimate protection. Is you're stationed. And if you want to understand how Putin views that, this is a quote. He appeared in an economic forum in St. Petersburg on June 20th and said that the Russians and Ukrainians are one people. In that sense, the whole of Ukraine is ours. And he said, there's a Russian parable, wherever a Russian soldier steps foot, that's ours. So imagine Putin. This is Putin's view of the world. He was in 1987. If there's Russian soldiers in East Germany, it means it's theirs. If there's Russian soldiers in Poland. So there's no way, the best way to protect being invaded again by Nazi Germans is to have Russian troops stationed there. And that is why that collapse of the Soviet Union is such a huge impact. Putin has called this, that he has said the worst geopolitical event of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. He didn't say World War II, where 20 million Russians died. He didn't say World War I. He didn't say the U.S. dropping nuclear bombs. He said the worst political event was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he was a KGB officer, so that's his view of the world, and he's surrounded. He's in charge. He doesn't share power with anyone, but the people around him that are his followers grew up in that Soviet security system where they knew the best way to defend the Russian heartland was to be in control in Eastern Europe. And again, when you look at their strategic space, again, United States, very fortunate. Russia, it was invaded by the Germans, invaded by the French, invaded by the Swedes, invaded by the Mongols. So they don't have there's no oceans to protect them. They have to use this strategic space of buffer zones, which is shown here. So again, the Russian Federation, when the Soviet Union collapsed, that great Russian heartland lost Eastern Europe. So now Germany's unified. It's a democratic Germany under West Germany, which in their view could be Nazis. Poles who fought war with Russia in 1921, now it's part of NATO. When he looks at the map, he sees when he was a KGB lieutenant colonel, Russia was protected. Now it's not protected. You see the great Russian heartland, Belarus, they're not, that is why he's obsessed with Ukraine. He's already lost the Baltic states. They're part of NATO. He's lost Poland. He's lost. And I'm not saying this is a correct view of the world. NATO is a defensive alliance, but I'm sharing with you the way Putin sees the world. And when he sees Ukraine talking about becoming part of NATO, he now, look at this map. He now sees Ukraine, look at that border on the right. Estonia, Latvia, and the Baltic states, Finland, they are now part of NATO. So great Russia has NATO soldiers. And again, this is what I'm sharing with you, NATO's view. Having been an American, I know NATO is a defensive alliance, but his view is shaped by his history of Soviet Union fighting the Nazis, fighting the Finns in 1939. And when he looks at the map and he sees Ukraine joining NATO, you now have a border where there could be US and German troops literally hundreds of miles. It's like a dagger pointing into the great Russian heart. And that is why Putin is so obsessed with Ukraine. And again, I'm not saying it's correct, but this is his view of the world. And so these are the strategic goals. It's very similar to China. When the Soviet Union existed, it was a multipolar world, the US and the Soviet Union got to have an influence in Angola, in Cuba, in Asia, in North Korea. And so they were a great power. And so this Primakov doctrine talks about going back to this multipolar world with major powers. And that's when Russians talk about being a great power, it doesn't mean that they have to destroy the United States. It means they need to have a seat at the table when major decisions are being made. So this was what they called the concert of Europe back in the 18th century. You had these great powers, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, the Austria-Hungary, and Russia, and nothing happened. Ottoman Empire collapsed, and they all decided how it was going to be carved up, and that's what Russia wants to get back to. Russia has to have a seat at the table if we're going to have negotiations with Iran for nuclear on nuclear capability. So Russia needs to return to that multipolar world, and they need to have primacy in the Soviet space. That They need to be the ones calling the shot in Belarus and Ukraine. Those were former Soviet republics. They are key to Russian security, and they need to be the ones that the US can't have influence in Ukraine. That needs to be part of the Soviet neighborhood. Because remember, they're the little Russians. And they need to oppose NATO expansion. Again, NATO is a defensive alliance, but in their view, it promotes things like democracy and transparency in civil society, which means people, the closer NATO gets to the Russians may say, hey, Poland's doing okay, Georgia's doing okay, Estonia's, why do we need an authoritarian Putin in charge? And they may push to have regime change. It's been kind of changed into the Gerasimov doctrine, but again, it still talks about Russia needs to be a great power, so it needs to be engaged in all the conversations, what's happening in the world. Not the U.S. We can't be hegemon. The U.S. can't just say, this is what we think should happen. We have to negotiate with Russia, oppose to NATO expansion, build that partnership with China. And this I talked about already. When you talk about the Russian world, that's a view of Putin's promoting to talk about the importance of Eastern Orthodox Christianity and this trinity of the Russian people, of Great Russians, Belarusians, which means white Russians. Bielo in Russian is white, and Little Russians. So the trinity of the Russian people, and that's why he's really promoting the Eastern Orthodox Church, because in that view, it gets Russians, people in Russia, see that as something they need to defend and work for. So what is Russia seeking? They're again, they want to have that ongoing, or they cannot have Ukraine join NATO. That would be something that would be a huge impact to Russian security. So they've got to at somehow, if they can't conquer it, get a regime change so that they don't have a leader who wants to be part of the West. And again, Kiev has always looked to the West, so they don't want to have that. And they're going to partner with like-minded authoritarian states like China, Iran, and North Korea to create this alternative multipolar world. And so that's what they're going to look for. They're going to look to how they can make sure that Ukraine is not going to be connected to the West. And they're going to use, just like China. Now, China has a much more, so here's the thing to understand about Russian and Chinese military. China has built a big military, but they haven't really used it. They fought the Vietnam in 1979. It really didn't go well for China. So they're developing aircraft carriers, but they have no real world experience in joint operations. Russia does. They have experience fighting in Georgia and in Syria, but they've really gotten chewed up by the Ukrainians. So they've kind of lost a lot of their military capability. So just like China, they need to enhance their chances of success by using cyber capabilities. And so they're going to use cyber operations in connection with kinetic operations to achieve success. And here are some examples of how they've done that. In 2007, there was this Russian soldier statue. You see that in the lower left. The Estonians were like, we don't want this statue in our downtown Tallinn. We're going to move it out to this Russian cemetery. The Russian speakers, there's a percentage of the Estonian population are ethnic Russians. They didn't like that. They protested, and then there were all these cyber attacks. In fact, you kind of saw the first ever cyber attacks with a political objective where they shut down Estonian financial sites and banks, and Estonians are doing everything online. So this really had an impact. And in fact, the NATO Center for Cyber Defense is in Estonia because the Estonians were the first country really, they developed and systems to overcome all of these DDoS attacks that were being directed against their financial institutions. Then a year later, Georgia, which looked like it was going to join NATO and was working with the United States military, there was this part of Georgia that was South Ossetia, that's non-Georgian. Anyway, a kinetic war breaks out, and at the same time, Russia targets through DDoS attacks and other cyber attacks Georgian websites and kind of cuts them off from access to the Western world. And then finally, you have what's happening in Ukraine. So Russia moved in 2015 into Crimea, and then they launched their massive invasion in 2022. And at the same time, Russia was actually conducting damaging attacks against the Ukrainian electric infrastructure to actually shut power down. And this is an example of a report that was done. This is Sandworm. So this shows how Russia was able to attack the Ukrainian. They got devices that were on the internet. They actually used phishing attacks to get in to the Ukrainian network, and then use that to move horizontally to get network administrative capabilities, and then went right into the operational control systems and SCADA systems, and were able to actually shut down breakers and shut off power. And this occurred in 2022. Again, Ukraine was able to limit, but this had an actual impact of actually having power outages occur in Ukraine through this Sandworm Russian actor. And again, this shows once they were in through the internet, through those devices that were internet facing, how they were able to shut that down. So the Russians have done this. This is an example of what they did to support their kinetic invasion of Ukraine. Is at the same time they were conducting cyber attacks to shut down industrial control systems and operational technology. And I'm just going to wrap up with, they actually now have seen, and again, you are all cyber professionals, but we're starting to see actual physical attacks against European military installations, foreign defense companies, logistics facilities, just like the Chinese want to impact the ability of the United States to deploy its forces into the Western Pacific to, say, support Taiwan. Russia is conducting sabotage against those agencies and organizations that are supporting Ukraine by actually recruiting criminal actors and maybe ethnic Russians to firebomb and conduct sabotage attacks against warehouses and other logistics facilities that they think are supplying the Ukrainian war effort. They're using cargo bombs, and they think they may have actually been a dry run so they could sabotage flights to the United States, arson attacks, bomb threats. So the reason I'm sharing this with you is that it's not just like they had used it successfully in Ukraine in their invasion. This is something that Russia may be positioning their cyber capabilities, that if they saw that the war was not achieving its own objectives, that they could do some sort of attacks against U.S. infrastructure that would sow in the American public the idea that we would say, why are my powers going out? I can't get in clean water. There is no inherent U.S. interest in Ukraine. That would even make the U.S. less likely to support them. And in this case, you may see actual physical attacks. Well, now we have no credible information. What I'm sharing with you has only been seen in Europe, where people have been arrested by European law enforcement. We haven't seen anything like this in the United States, but we are always forward looking and trying to look at the next type of threats that would occur. So this is what we're seeing in Europe. In addition to those cyber attacks in Ukraine, we have actually seen these types of people recruited by Russian security service that have done these types of attacks in European defense contractors and logistics facilities that they assess are supplying Russia. So I know that was a lot of information. I was over an hour and almost 20 minutes. I do want to open it for questions. That's my LinkedIn. I'm the only Kevin Worhurst in LinkedIn. So if you want to connect on LinkedIn, I would be happy to connect. But I am now going to stop sharing and go back and see if there are any questions in the limited amount of time that we have.
All right. Well, that was quite a history lesson there. Uh, we were discussing offline about how this should be an AP history class.
But with no exam. So
I was kidding around. I'll say like we could have 2 CPEs if you answer the questions. Um, but yeah, this was phenomenal. Thank you so much. Does anybody have any specific questions that they want to ask Kevin?
I do. Hi,
Go
Kevin.
ahead.
It's Michael Redmond. Kevin, I just have some of the countries you've mentioned and such. I was in Russia on 2012, February 2012, as Putin came and was announcing that he was going to presidency outside the Kremlin and everything. We quickly left, but that space, we knew the day before that was going to be happening. So, but they had 15,000 people from saying how wonderful he was, how great he was, just inside one of the things. That's not including outside the Kremlin. And whether people believe that or not, the support of the country for him or fear of not being for him was so visible. And yet I've gone to, I was also in Beijing, and very different culture than when I was in Taiwan. And, I was also in East Berlin when the Russians were there. Outside, and got to see the fields. Matter of fact, somebody that was on our street was taking a photo outside the Russian embassy for about 30 seconds. They came and took his camera to find the film. And so I saw these cultures. So my question is, looking at the cultures, looking at how Taiwan is getting ready to fight Russia using low-cost weapons. They've just built their first submarine. They have different tactics they're trying to look at for when they could be attacked, because they're expecting it, but they're not doing cyber offensive. As far as I've been able to tell, they're only doing the physical attacks. And I'm noticing that there seems to be I'm also in the certified emergency manager with IEM, and there's no talk there that I've been going to at conferences about, what we should be doing for attacks, what we should be doing for this, what's happening internationally. It's all about what happens when our infrastructure goes down. And as you discussed, we certainly know what they're doing right now to set the infrastructure. So my question is, using all of this, how do you see it all working? Since some of these are major players, and some of them see, and even when Russia dropped out of the Comic-Con, when the Comic-Con stopped because East Europe was becoming so prevalent in the economic world, the world changed. But through this, he has stayed very, very strong, as far as not only with Russia, but when he was prime minister, when he announced that he was going to become president again, which was announced in February of 2012, when he was going through all of these things. I can't believe I remember all this trivia. But anyway, my question is, how do you see this evolving, since some of the countries are not seeing the cyber? I don't know if the U.S. is, I know that the NSA, the FBI and such are taking it real, but I don't know if companies are taking it real. So how do you see this all working, and where do you see that there should be ramping up both in Taiwan, in these countries, the outside areas, including the
well, I mean, I would say, again, I'm an intel analyst, not a policymaker. And I think part of it is that, Taiwan is a vibrant democracy.
I mean from an attack point of view, not policy, but what you do.
I mean, it's much harder for Taiwan to do those directed attacks because there's so many parts of the society and the government that must agree on what they want to attack. And there's people in Taiwan that are engaged economically with China. So whereas China, Russia is authoritarian and they can just decide this is what we're going to attack. The problem with Taiwan and the United States and Japan is how do we come up with that decision to, like, as you say, the Taiwanese may not be preparing for offensive cyber operations, but that is when you launch an offensive cyber operation, it's like an act of war to a democracy. So it's just, I think they should be preparing it, but I can see them not, because it's a democracy and business interests or have a voice in the government, and lobbyists and people in their national cyber, defense are saying, well, if we have the capability, what will that cause? Just like our cyber offensive operations, require presidential approval. And so it's just much more difficult and challenging for a democracy to plan something like that than it is to plan the regular, military buildup. So I don't have an answer because
But no, you did answer it. You answered it quite well. I appreciate it because that gives me a better insight. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, it is. Yeah, we develop offensive cyber capabilities, but they're the most closely guarded secret. I can tell you, having been a military intelligence house, one thing that you never saw was what our computer network attack capabilities are. It's just that is the most protected operational information that we have.
Great, thank you.
All right, I think I got one more question before we let you go. Okay, Alex, you're up.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Great presentation. I loved it. I love that you mentioned specifically in Destroyer 2. So I was wondering, since we're talking about attacks to critical infrastructure, and we know about, the GRU's advanced capabilities when it comes to, ICS specific malware. Do you foresee a future in which the GRU gets together with China-based threat actors to attack US-based critical infrastructure in that capacity?
That is a great question. And that is probably the $1 million question, because I have read, I keep reading, it's a marriage of convenience. I would say that again, and this is just based on my own assessment of having been a senior leader, that again, a computer network attack is such a closely guarded capability because it can be so destructive. I've been reading about the Chinese hack. Like, I can't see where Russia would want the Chinese to know about their capability, or the Chinese would want the Russians to know. In fact, I've seen where the Russians have been, or the Chinese have been, like, hacking into Russian capabilities. So, and plus, when you're an authoritarian, I mean, my own analysis and reading about the GRU and the SVR is, everything has to be a wilderness of mirrors and things have to be protected. So having not had real military, China and Russia do these military exercises, but it's not real. That's not an alliance. They're not allies. It's not like NATO, where we are integrated and train operationally. And if they're not doing that militarily, I don't see how they could possibly do that from a cyber realm. Because even in NATO, we have our, military, where we're completely integrated with naval and air, and we still have very limited cyber attack capabilities that are shared. I don't I would think it could happen, but I think it would be, I don't see it very likely, at least unless there's some sort of change in the geopolitical climate.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, Kevin, thank you so much. You did a lot of talking. We'll give you a break.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the opportunity. As an intelligence analyst, I am about transparency. So the more people know and understand the threat, the better protected we are. So I thank you for the opportunity to come, to have me be able to engage with so many great professionals.
Thank you very much.